Hello, this is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness. This is a video introduction to the Evolution of Science Fiction webinar series. I'm Tom Lombardo, Director of the Center for Future Consciousness. The Center for Future Consciousness produces a biannual newsletter containing essays on the future and related topics, future consciousness insights. I'm a psychologist, a philosopher, futurist, student of wisdom, and avid fan and writer on science fiction. Here's a number of my books, which I published in these different areas of future studies and philosophy and science fiction. The most recent three books are Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution, The Pursuit of Virtue, The Path to a Good Future, and Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. The mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. This webinar series will be based upon my book series, Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. Volume 1, Prometheus to the Martians, has already been published. Volume 2, The Time Machine to Metropolis, and Superman to Star Maker are completed and will be published soon. And presently I'm working on Volumes 4, The Golden Age to the New Wave, and Star Wars to the Singularity and Beyond. This is a big picture overview of the entire content of the science fiction webinar series. There are going to be 16 educational modules in it, beginning with what is science fiction, and a second module on the relationship of mythology, fantasy, and science fiction. And then the remaining 14 modules will cover the chronological history of science fiction, beginning with ancient history and the ancient Greeks and mythology, up through the new millennium, the new weird, the singularity, and beyond. The content today of this webinar introduction is to highlight and review each of these educational modules, which will give you a flavor for the topics and themes, the significant books and significant writers who appeared during each of these periods within the history of science fiction. So the next half an hour or so, I'm going to be highlighting one or two elements out of each of these modules so that you can see what this whole series is all about. The opening module is what is science fiction? And here we have the four central characters out of the Big Bang TV series, Sheldon, Leonard, Howard, and Rahesh, who are walking through the California desert dressed up in Star Trek outfits on their way to a Comic-Con convention. And these four characters represent one important element, a central element of what science fiction is. Science fiction, in fact, is a way of life. These four characters go to science fiction conventions, go to comic book conventions, play science fiction video games, watch science fiction movies repeatedly over and over again and discuss them, have science fiction toys and paraphernalia and art throughout their apartments, and pretty much live, breathe, and almost eat science fiction. In fact, Sheldon has as his super ego or ego ideal, Mr. Spock from Star Trek. And in fact, his friends think sometimes that Sheldon is actually a robot or in fact an alien from outer space. So they experience reality in the context of science fiction. they dress up, they act it, they think it, they see the world in terms of it. In fact, to use a concept from Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science fiction for them is a paradigm for living and understanding reality and the future. Here's a variety of images of science fiction fans at science fiction conventions dressed up in various science fiction outfits. And in fact, dressing up as science fiction characters isn't just simply something one does to look interesting, unusual, fit into the feeling of science fiction. These outfits become emblems of their social or personal role that they adopt in life. That is, the dressing up is part of their personal identity, who they are. In the center, there is a picture of a 9-foot-tall statue of the Shrike, a very famous character in Dan Simmons' Hyperion series, a classic contemporary science fiction novel series with Clee Richardson, the artist who created the Shrike. This Shrike sits in the driveway, the entrance to Dan Simmons' house in Colorado. And in fact, science fiction fans and writers will in various ways embellish and decorate their very living arrangements in terms of science fiction imagery. So science fiction is a way of life. It is a way of understanding reality. It's a lot more than just simply the literature. It's multidimensional. The second module that I cover is the relationship between mythology, fantasy, and science fiction. And as you'll note, the title of my book series contains the expression evolutionary mythology of the future. And in my mind, science fiction and mythology are very similar in many respects. And that's going to be one of the themes I cover in this second module. A thing to highlight from that module is, here is a list of qualities of myth that I have put together from studying Joseph Campbell's books, including The Power of Myth, Carl Jung and his ideas on archetypes and symbols of the conscious and unconscious mind, and various other sources on myth. And as you can see, looking at the list, we find characteristics like myths are archetypal, they're transcendent, they're narratives, they make predictions, they answer deep questions about life, they get people into immersive participation, they have an aesthetic dimension, there's icons and symbols. In fact, they stimulate holistic consciousness. Now, these are all dimensions of science fiction. Indeed, science fiction has all the same mythic dimensions that ancient mythologies have. And in this sense, science fiction and mythology are pretty much the same. Now, I wouldn't say identical, because there's going to be some differences, which we'll talk about, but there's a great overlap between what science fiction deals with and how it presents its images, its narratives, its stories, and what it stimulates in the human mind, and what myth did too. And in fact, to take a quote from a very well-known study of the history of science fiction by Alexei and Corey Panshin, that I will talk about throughout the series, science fiction is a literature of the mythic imagination. Now, again, there's going to be differences between science fiction and myth, but in a lot of ways, science fiction literally is our contemporary mythology. In Module 3, I go into ancient history from 1000 BC up through the tail end of the Middle Ages. And I'm going to be covering the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is a fantastical adventure with strange sights and strange beings, which is one of the significant thematic elements that works itself into science fiction. Talk about Greek mythology that has in it, for example, Hephaestus, who was the god of metallurgy, and in fact, mythically is credited with creating robots and automatons. So the idea of robots and automatons goes back a long way. Prometheus, who stole the secret of fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. There's an image up there of the city of God by St. Augustine, which is a vision of the future evolution and perfection of humanity. Although it's theologically informed, it still is a futurist utopian vision in City of God. Leonardo da Vinci's various designs on technological possibilities, such as his design here of a tank. And finally, down in the right-hand corner, interestingly, we have this image of a boat being pushed up into the sky in a funnel of water, which is the cover for Lucian's True History. And Lucian's True History, written around 2,000 years ago, is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, adventure story of traveling into outer space and engaging in a battle in outer space involving aliens from the moon and other planets in the solar system. So the antecedents of science fiction, elements of it, go back all the way to ancient times. In the next module, we talk about the rise of science, the scientific revolution, and the emergence of modernity. Up here, there are images of Kepler and of Copernicus and of Isaac Newton. And these figures, as scientists, astronomers, they were individuals who transformed our understanding of nature, transformed our understanding of the universe, and opened the universe up to the human mind, much more so than it had been before. And this was very significant in informing and inspiring the development of modern science fiction. We also have up here an image of Christian Huygens, who was a scientist and astronomer who discovered the moon Titan around Saturn, a cover of his book Cosmotheros, which is the first scientifically informed discussion of what aliens on other planets might be like based on the conditions of other planets. So the idea of aliens and living on other planets and what that would be like, something goes back to the beginning of the scientific revolution. Up here, we also have an image of Francis Bacon's book, The New Atlantis, which is an early utopia, but it's an early utopia that is scientifically and technologically informed, with many different predictions about future technologies and how they would impact future possible technologies, how they would impact human society and human life. And so we get this idea developing in Francis Bacon, which is carried on later on, of imagining societies that are restructured and empowered with advances in technology and science. Kepler, who is in the middle there underneath, wrote a significant story called Somni and the Dream, in which we travel to the moon, and Kepler provides a very detailed and scientifically informed description of the moon and lunar inhabitants. So during the period of 1500 to 1750, the world transforms, the universe transforms, and people begin to write stories and consider possibilities of outer space travel and of advancing technologies and of utopias and of what aliens would be like if we encounter them in our travels into outer space. And Kepler believed, in fact, in the 17th century, that we would indeed someday travel into outer space. Next, we move into the Enlightenment and Romanticism and the Gothic, 1750 to 1820. And this is module number 5. And up here we have an image of the Eskimo Nebula, which was discovered by the great astronomer William Herschel in 1787. And Herschel contributed some very significant insights and discoveries into the further advance of astronomy. In particular, he presented a lot of convincing evidence that the stars and the universe out there were not static and eternal, but were transforming. And that indeed we lived in a dynamic, transforming universe. And this would have a significant impact upon thinking about outer space travel and about alien worlds. And William Herschel, in fact, believed that there were inhabitants on different worlds, including the moon. And he built incredibly gigantic telescopes, which totally enriched the advance of astronomy during the 18th century. We also have a lot of other images up here, including Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was a combination of the Romantic and Gothic in terms of its feeling and conception. And that was one significant theme or philosophical movement that was contributory to the evolution of science fiction, the Romantic and the Gothic, which emphasized feeling and emphasized dark and frightening realities. But there was also the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason and science. During this period, we have the presumed first story about aliens visiting the Earth, Micromegas, by one of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, in which a character from the star system Sirius and another alien from the planet Saturn come and visit the Earth, and they are giants. We have a very bleak but highly descriptive vision of the end of the world, The Last Man by Granville, one of the most depressing novels I've ever read. We have The Floating City from Gulliver's Travels, created by scientists, and we have Condorcet's book up there on the future evolution of humanity based upon universal education and the development of reason and science. So people are thinking about the future evolution of humanity within the period of the Age of Enlightenment, but they're also thinking about frightening possibilities in the future too. And so we have this contrast between the Enlightenment and the Romantic and Gothic philosophies that feed into science fiction. Next, we move into the first part of the 19th century from Edgar Allan Poe through Jules Verne. Up here, there's an image of the Sandman, which actually is a more frightening and unnerving novel than Frankenstein, in which there is a female robot that the central character falls in love with, but it's very spooky too. We have the original Mummy, which was actually was written by a woman, James Loudon. And it's a very significant novel in that it's the first really detailed description of a future human society, in this case, the 22nd century. And the mummy in this is actually a good guy, not someone evil. We have some images up here on the screen from Jules Verne's Great Adventures, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, as well as Journey to the Center of the Earth. We'll talk about Edgar Allan Poe and his visions about the distant future, such as in his book Eureka. And up here we also have an image of Jules Verne's last novel, Paris in the 20th Century, which wasn't published while he was alive, but it's an interesting contrast with his great adventure stories that he wrote, such as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Around the World in 80 Days, etc. This is a very bleak vision of the future in which the central character is a poet who can't survive in a techno-economic dominated future reality. The next module we go into centers around evolution and the theory of evolution. In the center there we have an image of Darwin. And the theory of evolution, in my mind, had a significant impact on the growth of science fiction. The Origin of Species came out in 1859. The Descent of Man came out in 1859 and 1872. And during that period, and right afterwards, the number of science fiction novels that are published, significant ones, begins to increase tremendously. The same year The Descent of Man was published, Erewhon was published, and The Coming Race was published. And Erewhon is a discussion, among other things, the dystopian discussion of the evolution of machines, taking the concept of evolution and applying it to technology. The Coming Race is a discussion of the evolution of cyborgs who live underground, a very popular novel at the time. Looking Backward, which was a very popular utopian novel, talks about an ideal human society built upon socialist principles. The 20th Century, an incredibly rich and vivid slice of life of the Future, written by Albert Robida, is significant in that Robida not only wrote this very rich and prescient view of the future, one of the great science fiction novels of the 19th century, but he illustrated it. He was the first great science fiction artist of his time. We also have the first best-selling science fiction novel published in America, A Journey in Other Worlds by John Jacob Astor, the very famous rich individual who created the Astor Hotel and died on the Titanic. And it is an incredible vision of progress, of evolution, of journeying to other worlds, of weaving science together with mysticism and religion. In the center, underneath Darwin, we have an image of Camille Flammarion, who wrote cosmic, astronomical, and mystical informed various tales. And not only was very popular as a writer of astronomy, but conducted seances in his house. Tomorrow's Eve, which is a story about a robot created by Thomas Edison, who's a character in the story. And we have robots all over the place by the end of the 19th century. In fact, the dime novels in America between 1870 and 1900 had lots of robotic humans and robotic animals, beginning with a very famous The Steam Man of the Prairies in the beginning of the 1870s. So a lot happened between the beginning of Darwin's theory of evolution and toward the end of the 19th century. We're going to do a whole module on H.G. Wells, because H.G. Wells is very significant in the history of science fiction and in future studies. He's often seen as the father of modern science fiction, but he's also often identified as the father of modern future studies. We remember him best today for his famous science fiction novels such as The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, The Time Machine. But H.G. Wells actually wrote more nonfiction on the future than fiction. And he wove together his thinking about the possibilities of the future with his science fiction narratives. The best example of this is his monumental and intellectually very impressive work, The Shape of Things to Come, which is a combination or a synthesis of historical scholarship, analysis of contemporary affairs, futuristic thinking, and science fiction. Other significant novels or nonfiction, fiction combined in that respect include A Modern Utopia and The Sleeper Awakes. So Wells is going to have a big impact on science fiction, he's going to have a big impact on future studies, and he's worth a whole module. The next module we look at is the early 20th century, dystopias, disasters, adventures, films, and the pulse. May you live in interesting times, Confucius. And indeed, the early 20th century was very interesting and very eventful. We had the beginnings of modern art. We had the rise of communism. We had the beginnings of the movies. We had aircraft. We had telephones being distributed. We had electricity. We had jazz, we had the Roaring Twenties, we had automation, Henry Ford and automobiles. We had the Great Depression. We had lots of things going on in those first few decades, including World War I, too. And during this period, there was an incredible amount of significant science fiction produced, and not just now science fiction narratives and stories, but this is the time when science fiction movies emerged. In the middle there on top, we have an image from Méliès's Journey to the Moon. And this is probably the first science fiction movie. And him and his wife actually colored in all of the individual images in the film. So we have a first colored science fiction movie here too, but it was silent. By the time you get up to the middle 1920s, we have the incredible movie Metropolis, and which was also a book that was written by Fritz Lang's wife. Fritz Lang and his wife produced the movie, but the book is also a fantastical read as well. And Metropolis is, I think, one of the best science fiction movies ever made. It's probably, no question about it, the best silent science fiction movie ever made. And there's many figures that are significant and very influential figures. Edgar Rice Burroughs on the left, probably so more copies of science fiction adventure stories, adventure novels than anybody else in history. He invented Tarzan, but he also had great adventures to Mars and to Venus and underneath the Earth. We have this interesting image of Hugo Gernsback on the opposite side, holding his monocle, who is the person credited with popularizing the term science fiction. And Gernsback began science fiction magazines back in the 1920s. We have comics too, Buck Rogers. We have incredibly fantastical images of aliens, such as in The Metal Monster by Abraham Merritt, which is a story about a creature that consists of trillions upon trillions of individual metallic parts that can self-organize and reconfigure themselves into multiple different forms. We have The Navigators of the Infinite by Rosny the Elder, in which we have this very touching love affair between a human and a Martian. The Nightland on the right-hand upper side is a story about the far, far distant future, millions upon millions of years ahead. And The Purple Cloud, which is a great disaster novel up on the left-hand side. And Jack London wrote science fiction as well during this time. And we have the famous dystopian novel written around the time of the Communist Revolution, Yevgeny Ziamatin's We, which is, in my mind, probably the best dystopian novel of all. And it's a very fascinating work, and it definitely reflects the times going on and presents what is kind of like an ambiguous dystopia. And it's definitely worth reading. We also have things like The Wonder, which are speculations on the evolution of humans, and The Voyage to Arcturus, which is a surrealistic and psychedelic trip to the star system Arcturus. When we come up to the 1930s, we see the emergence of space opera. The pulps get astounding, and there is cosmic horror of incredible imaginative dimensions in that period. There's a whole variety of different anthologies which have been published since, which collect together a lot of the great stories of the 1930s. Two of them are Before the Golden Age by Isaac Asimov, and Adventures in Time and Space, which also collects into it great stories of the 1940s too. And those books you could still buy. Anthologies come into the picture in science fiction. H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come was made into a movie, Things to Come, and a lot of people think this was the first great sound science fiction movie. And though it does have the problem of, given the fact that it is a movie, it is nowhere near as rich in thinking and ideas as the book was. But it is a comprehensive vision of the future. During that same time, Karel Čapek, a Czech writer, wrote The War with the Newts, which sounds like a silly title, but in fact is one of the most interesting and integrative and intelligent visions of the future that was produced in the 1930s. And it's considered a classic and definitely worth reading, and it's a real bleak commentary on the nature of humanity. As I mentioned, there's cosmic horror in the 1930s. The famous Who Goes There by John Campbell. H.P. Lovecraft's stories, including The Shadow Out of Time, where Lovecraft combines this incredible literate and rich vocabulary and capacity to visualize with amazingly frightening and bleak and horrific realities that expand out into space and time. An amazing writer and rather depressed and crazy at the same time. And his good friend Clark Ashton Smith, who was probably the most poetic and colorful and lyrical writer of the 1930s in science fiction. And here's an image of his story, The Monster of the Prophecy. And one of the questions in that story is figuring out who indeed is the monster in the story. During the 30s, we get the rise of space operas, and a significant figure who wrote lots of great space adventures was Edmund Hamilton. I have up here the cover to a collection of his stories, Crashing Suns, which is definitely worth reading, although it's almost 100 years old now. We also get more time travel stories. One of the best that came out in the 1930s was Jack Williamson's The Legion of Time, in which different possible futures war with each other in the present to see which future will come to pass and which one will not materialize. A very philosophically interesting novel. In the 1920s and 30s, the person who was most responsible for developing and popularizing space opera was Doc Smith. His two big series, the Skylark of Space and the Lensman series, involve spaceships and battles and weapons and enemies and aliens that are of colossal proportions and magnitude and size. And the Lensmen are techno-enhanced cyborgs who have powers facilitated through technology, but using their minds to manipulate reality in incredible dimensions. And although Smith is often criticized as not being a very good writer, his imagination was stupendous, cosmic in scope. And he's the beginning of the line of thinking that comes down into Star Wars. But finally, we have Ola Stapledon, who was the most cosmic of all, and in Last and First Men traces the future history of humanity 2 billion years into the future, and in Star Maker traces the future history of the universe and the evolution of cosmic intelligence 30 to 50 billion years into the future. And no one exceeded Stapleton in terms of cosmic scope and imagination. So again, there's an awful lot of richness in science fiction in the 1930s, and we will talk about all of these as well as other writers and books in that module. Then we come to the Golden Age, module 11. The Golden Age is often identified with John Campbell, who I had up on the previous side as having been the writer for Who Goes There. John Campbell became the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, the pulp magazine. And when he was the editor during the late 1930s into the 1940s, he cultivated and developed an approach to science fiction which emphasized better writing, more plausible and interesting, engaging plot lines, better development of characterization, more realistic, as well as at the same time being imaginative and extrapolating on science and technology, but also social trends too. And he was the person responsible for popularizing and bringing to attention, public attention, writers like Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and A.E. Van Vogt and many other writers in the late 1930s and into the 1940s. Here's just a sample of some of the covers of Astounding, including Slan and Black Destroyer by Van Vogt, two very famous science fiction novel stories, and Private Eye by Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore, which were a very famous husband and wife team, which wrote for Campbell. We have several images up there from Robert Heinlein, The Sixth Column, and if this goes on, we also have The Mule, which became part of the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, with Folded Hands by Jack Williamson. So during this period, we have space operas, aliens, alien worlds, robots, future histories, social psychological fiction. We have a lot happening in science fiction pulp magazines due to John Campbell's direction and leadership. And it was a time of significant evolution while World War II was going on. Then we move into the Silver Age, the next module, 1950 to 1965. It was during this time that science fiction movies really took off, such as Forbidden Planet, The War of the Worlds, Invasion from Mars, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, that as science fiction movies evolved and became much better, much more popular, much more vivid and colorful, but also science fiction entered into the new media of TV. And in fact, toward the end of this period, along another dimension of visualization, Stan Lee began to create a whole new slew of science fiction superheroes, such as Spider-Man and the Hulk. And so comic books evolved past the earlier period where we had Buck Rogers and Batman and Superman. So there was the visual element evolving during the Silver Age. There were a lot of new science fiction magazines which appeared on the scene. But there were a lot of great novels, beginning with The Demolished Man, the first novel to win the Hugo for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. A fantastic and interesting and inventive novel about a future in which the police can read minds. And Ray Bradbury with The Martian Chronicles and other works became a very popular writer during that time. And I have up here a number of other images of great novels of that period, Dune toward the end of the period. And one of the best science fiction novels of all time, Mechanical for Leibowitz, which is a synthesis of religious thinking and science fiction that takes place after World War III, centering around a monastery in Utah. So the 1950s definitely produced a lot of really good science fiction novels. In ways, the novels of the 50s and early 60s I thought were better than the few novels that in fact were produced in the earlier period, the Golden Age. Toward the end of this time, you see the emergence of Philip Dick. And Philip Dick is a bridge between the Silver Age and the next two periods of science fiction. He's an anticipator. He influences people for the next 20, 30 years in terms of how he writes and what he thinks. The Man in the High Castle is an alternative reality novel, won the Hugo too, in which Germany and Japan won World War II. Ubik is a story about a number of people who believe they're communicating with the dead, but then it finally turns out they realize that they're the ones dead communicating with the living. Philip Dick pushed the possibilities of reality. He questioned our normal notions of reality. He questioned what we mean by sanity, what we mean by ourselves. Philip K. Dick was a metaphysical writer who also was informed by a variety of different visions and hallucinations that he had throughout his life. And he, after his death, he actually became even more popular, died relatively young, but he's a bridge to cyberpunk. He's a bridge to the new wave that come up in the next couple of decades, because he's anticipating a lot of the themes and styles to come. In fact, the next module number 13, is the new culture and the new wave. So as we get the hippie revolution in pop culture, we get a revolution that is resonant with it in science fiction. Here's a quote from Philip Jose Farmer, one of the great writers of the new wave, who introduced, more than anybody else did at the time, sex into science fiction. If Jules Verne could have really looked into the future, say 1966 AD, he would have cracked in his pants. And 2166, oh my. So during this time, we get the erotic, the blasphemous, the dangerous, the lyrical, the psychedelic, the maniacal, the catastrophic. We get incredibly jolting visions of reality in the future emerging in science fiction. Behold the Man, a story about a man who goes back in time in a time machine to see if Christ actually did rise from the dead. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, about a computer that tortures the last 5 humans alive. The Son of Man, which has more sex in it than any other novel I've ever read, and it's psychedelic at the same time too. Lord of Light, in which we have techno-empowered Hindu deities, Brahman and Shiva, and a techno-empowered Buddha. The Crystal World, which is an amazingly psychedelic story about the world turning into crystals. Great novels about war, future wars, the Forever War, and Slaughterhouse-Five, which was made into a movie. Presumably, but then trying to make the Forever War into a movie for a long time. A great new wave movie was Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick, a movie that's dystopian, musical, colorful, psychologically unsettling, Beethoven and madness and psychopathology all rolled into one. Very new wave. The most significant element of the new wave, though, was the emergence of women science fiction writers. Women having a much greater voice in science fiction. There have been women science fiction writers before, like Catherine Moore, but women really came into their own in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, in conjunction with the feminist movement occurring within popular culture. Three of the most significant women science fiction writers were Ursula Le Guin, her great novel, The Dispossessed, Joanna Russ, her great novel, The Female Man, and James Tiptree Jr., who was really a woman. And here's one of her books, Her Smoke Rose Up Forever. And I'll have some interesting stories about James Tiptree Jr. and who she really was. I think, though, that the best new wave novel written during this period was Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner. And Stand on Zanzibar synthesizes a lot of the new wave into this colossally impressive book that has 4 different tables of content and jumps around in a very anticipatory way with respect to our fragmented mode of consciousness today, and is just very, very rich and creating this vision of the near future. And it's one of those kinds of books where you have to sit and you have to read it in order to really experience the unique quality of it. And Stand on Zanzibar won Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year when it came out, I think, in 1969. The 1980s, part 14. The dreams our stuff is made of, how science fiction conquered the world. Now that's a title from a book written, actually the book was written in 1999 by Thomas Disch, who is a science fiction writer turned historian of science fiction. And Thomas Disch presents the argument in his book that, in fact, science fiction has conquered the world because the stuff, the material of our reality is made up out of the dreams of science fiction. And so in the 1980s, one of the things I'm going to talk about, among other things, is going to be how science fiction did indeed conquer the world, conquered our consciousness. And one way to see that, one noteworthy way to see it, is as we come into the late 70s and into the 80s, almost all of the most popular, biggest money-making movies of all time became science fiction movies, and for the last 40 years have stayed so. So beginning with Star Wars and Close Encounters and Alien and Aliens and Predator and Terminator and Back to the Future, when you look at the top 10, the top 20 money-making movies, whether it's the 80s, 90s, and into the new millennium, most of them are science fiction. Science fiction dominates the cinema. E.T., I forgot to mention, which was a very big and popular movie. So I have this quote here from John Clute: everything else is looking more like science fiction, that is, the world around us is, and science fiction is looking more like everything else, meaning science fiction is looking increasingly realistic. So, although these are some of the most popular movies of that period, of the late 70s, early 80s, I think 2 qualitatively best science fiction movies ever made were produced in the 1980s, and they weren't as big sellers at the time. Brazil by Terry Gilliam, who was a member of Monty Python, and is a fantastically funny and interesting dystopia, and Blade Runner, which is based on Philip Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And that became a great piece of work in the cinema, as well as being a very interesting novel to begin with. In the cinema, it was with Harrison Ford. And a lot of people, of course, have seen Blade Runner, and I think Blade Runner is pretty much equal in quality, if not a little bit better than Brazil. But those 2 movies came out in the 1980s. Moving into the 1990s, in the next module, we see the emergence of steampunk. We see an increased interest in evolution. And we go way out into the far future all over again, just like we had with Ola Stapledon and with Hodgson's The Night Lamp. We get some of the most intricate, expansive, and rich visions of the future ever produced during the 1990s. Hyperion, Venor Vingi's A Fire Upon the Deep, 10,000 years into the future. The Time Ships by Stephen Baxter, which is the sequel to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, that takes up the story right where the time machine leaves off. And we go to the end of time and back to the beginning of time in it. The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, an extremely rich vision of the future that takes place in and around China. The Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, so realistic and integrative and multidimensional a vision of the terraforming and settling of Mars that you forget you're in a science fiction novel. Steampunk, The Anubis Gates, Queen of Angels by Greg Beer, in which a computer tries to prove to itself that it is conscious while psychologists invade the mind of a madman and a murderer trying to figure out why he committed the crimes he did. And Diaspora, in which we go out into the far distant future with artificial, virtual human minds attempting to understand the cosmos. Great philosophical piece of work. When we come to the new millennium, the last 20 years, the new millennium, the new weird, the singularity and beyond, one thing we continue to see is that visualization, both TV and cinema, science fiction, continues to evolve. One of the most significant science fiction, what would I call it, science fiction stories ever written, Watchmen, first appears as a graphic novel in the 1980s, then is made into a movie, I think around 2010, and then appears as a TV series just this last year. And Watchmen is a very fascinating alternate reality view, a cynical but realistic view about superheroes. Avatar, probably the most beautiful movie ever made, and for a time, the biggest money-making movie ever made, I believe. Ex Machina, which is a fascinating science fiction movie on the Turing test. Could we tell if this is a computer or a human that we're speaking with? And the most visually stunning science fiction series so far to be put up on TV, The Expanse, in which we have a very imaginative, non-stereotypical alien, and we have a very intricate plot involving politics and personality and culture and the settling of the solar system and the great beyond that, and many other factors, including a whole variety of very interesting women as central heroes within the saga, which is also what happens when we get to the Watchmen TV series. There have been a lot of great novels in the last 20 years as well. Hominids, a story about an alternate reality in which Neanderthals evolve into a modern civilization, Homo sapiens go extinct. The Three Body Problem trilogy by Jean Liu, written in China, showing us that science fiction indeed is going on all over the world, and China is being one of the places where a lot of science fiction is being produced and read. And the Three Body Problem won the Hugo a couple years ago, and it's a fascinating story synthesizing an incredible understanding of science, Western science too, philosophy, Chinese culture, and dealing with the question of, should we be trying to contact aliens? Maybe it's not such a good idea to send signals out into outer space. Many other great novels of the last 20 years. Accelerando, which deals with the singularity emerging in the 21st century, and humans have to hightail it out of the solar system to get away from it. River of Gods, which is a really excellent novel about future India and about the, where would I put it? The reality of the Hindu gods being demonstrated in a very interesting time travel way in the story. I think, though, that the best thing produced of the last 20 years, the most imaginatively rich and bizarre and strange, is China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, which combines cyberpunk, steampunk, gothic, fantasy, science fiction, horror, drugs, alternate realities, all woven together into unbelievable, imaginative and bizarre vision of a city and some alternate reality. So that brings us to the end of this review of the modules that we'll be covering throughout this series, this webinar series. If you are interested in participating in the series, you can get in touch with me through the Center for Future Consciousness. The series is probably going to be offered one module every 2 weeks or so, and we may be repeating modules if people are particularly interested in them. So thanks for listening, and I'm Tom Lombardo from the Center for Future Consciousness, and write to me if you're interested in participating within the webinar series on the evolution of science fiction.